Why did a prison inmate threaten to slit Boris Becker's throat? And how did the former Wimbledon champion escape unscathed? Boris Becker's new book Inside discusses his time in prison and how he discovered humility and stoicism, despite living with some of the country's most dangerous murderers, paedophiles and gang leaders. He talks about how he built relationships and formed friendships that would go deeper than anything he'd ever experienced. In this video, I'll discuss the main themes in the book and give you my honest thoughts on it. And in a couple of minutes, I will tell you how Becker ended up with a threat against his life. In 2022, Boris Becker was jailed for evasion of assets as a debtor and money laundering. Throughout the book, which is ghostwritten by Tom Fordyce, Becker states how he borrowed almost £4 million to stave off his debts and owed a former business partner 40 million Swiss francs. Becker commented that even if he worked till he was 80, he wouldn't be able to pay off that kind of debt. Although Becker moved from Wandsworth prison to Huntercombe prison, the first thing he notes about prison is the screaming through the night. He writes, "It's a screaming that cuts you the deepest. Screaming like someone is hurt, screaming like someone needs help, screaming like someone is dying." Now, this is a far cry from the pop of a serve and the roll of applause on centre court. Prison was such a fall from grace for Boris Becker, who was of course tennis world #1 and won 7 Grand Slams. Along with Goran Ivanisevic, he's also the only unseeded player ever to win the men's Wimbledon singles. And given his fame, Becker knew he'd be a target in prison. Wandsworth was a ruthless prison which had also housed the likes of Gary Glitter, Pete Doherty and the Craze. There were so many intimidating characters in jail that Becker would very much keep himself to himself and not even make eye contact with anyone. And this was so interesting to me because a big part of tennis is having that poker face and showing that nothing is bothering you. But you couldn't do that in prison. It was just much more effective to slink into the background. Still, once Becker learned prison's codes and conventions, he did become quite respected. So much so that when a convicted murderer threatened to slit Becker's throat, his friends beat the living daylights out of him. This happened when Boris saw his attacker, Zach, standing in the cell of one of Boris's friends, Ike. Now, in prison, unless you're really good friends with someone, you certainly wouldn't enter anyone else's cell, especially alone. So Boris confronted Zach about this, and Zach said, "I'm gonna slit your throat, I'm gonna kill you." Soon enough, around 6 inmates arrived, told Boris to leave, and then they just beat the shit out of Zach. Ike apologised profusely to Boris about the incident, and he was adamant that Zach should say sorry to Boris for starting on him. But Boris showed restraint and said who was he to tell someone where they could or couldn't be. He knew prison could break people, and he had an inkling that that was what was happening with Zach. What's more, this showed the bond between Ike and Boris and really what kind of admiration stood between the two men. Ike was a one-time high-level drug dealer who found solace in prison in working out and going to the gym. He and Boris gelled so well that when they were both released, Ike travelled to Milan to surprise Boris at his birthday party. Boris also befriended a guy called Shuggy who was in prison for gang-related violence and would find that level of calm and peace through prayer and his religion. He was warm, jovial and would leave his cell door open so people could come in and chat to him. Although Boris bonded with the likes of Ike and Shuggy, both men were in prison for over 8 years. They mentioned that when you're in prison for that long, prison never leaves you, even when you're on the outside. So Boris was well aware that no matter how well-intentioned Ike and Shuggy were, there was still that darkness that lurks underneath in them. However, one way Boris tried to step out of that darkness was through a stoicism course taught by his friend Andy. Now, Stoicism is a philosophy that originated in around 300 BC in Athens. It centres around virtue, temperance, and freedom from those destructive emotions. That is, of course, a very brief rundown of Stoicism. I would need literally hours to give you a bigger rundown. Andy handed out a leaflet at the course stating, "The problems we have are nearly always created by ourselves." During the course, Becker read a quote which read, "It's not what happens to you that matters, but how you react to it." The quote is attributed to the philosopher and former slave Epictetus. Becker describes the classroom as pretty old school actually, with a blackboard at the front and rows of desks in almost like a schoolroom format. He said if attendees stayed for the whole class and contributed, they were rewarded by being given time in the gym. This gave a real insight into prison and how people could either survive or stagnate behind bars. As such, Becker would lean into stoicism and practice non-judgement, which is a big part of that philosophy. After all, Stoic philosophers have always said that events and people will let you down, so you may as well just prepare in advance for that occurrence. For instance, Boris was speaking to a people smuggler in prison. He said, "I listened to it. That was where I was now. I listened and passed no judgment. I listened some more." He would also hear stories from people who had brokered international drug deals. He said, "I didn't move, I didn't judge, and I wasn't surprised. There were no whistles of shock and no outrage." Therefore, I feel this outlook of acceptance just really helped Boris in prison. Now, I've told some pretty explosive stories about the violence in prison and Boris's outlook and mindset at the time. I've probably made the book sound more gripping than I actually really found it. It was quite dull and samey in places, and that's probably because prison is essentially quite a repetitive and bland environment. Not very much happens every day. Every day is pretty much like the last, I'd imagine. Another thing which I couldn't really get on with in the book is where Boris will sometimes have these reflections in jail on his tennis career. He keeps going back to when he won Wimbledon as a 17-year-old, so he would talk about his feelings leading up to the final. Then he'd go even further back to when he was going through the tournament, and then he would go back forwards once more again to what he was feeling when he was in the locker room before the match. And this non-linear narrative just jarred with me a little bit. I just didn't feel that it worked well at all, and it just didn't really feel that entertaining or cohesive to me. In the book, I just felt that there was a lack of jeopardy because we know that Boris Becker is now out of prison. It's public knowledge. It's definitely a case where the only reason that I finished the book was simply because I was reviewing it. So there are some interesting stories in here, but if you want a much better book written by a tennis player, Open by Andre Agassi is absolutely fantastic. I have reviewed that on my channel. I will link to that in the description of this video. I've also heard really great things about The Racket by Connor Nyland, so I can't wait to read that. So with that said, thanks so much for spending a bit of your day with me again today, and see you soon.